We now turn to the fourth and final major section of the Old Testament, a collection of books known as the prophets. Now, this name can be a little bit confusing because how oftentimes the Jewish people, even Jesus, referred to what we call the Old Testament was simply law and prophets, law being the first 5 books, everything else being prophets. But today, when we talk about the Old Testament, as we've seen throughout this course, we've broken it up into our own kind of 4 divisions: law, Torah, the first 5, then the history, the books that sort of tell the story. Then you have the writings, the wisdom, Psalms, things like that. And now you actually have what we literally call prophets. And so this is its own section of the Old Testament. There's 16 books, and these books range greatly in size. Some are very short, some are very long, and in content. All of them, though, are written roughly in the same time period, mid-8th century, around 750 BC, to the mid-5th century, around 450, 460. And they are written by the individuals named. And this is actually very important. This is something we need to harp on and sort of really nail down on. Unlike many of the books that we've read so far, as we've been going through this course and we start each book, I often give you who's the author, date, and we don't know, things like that. These books, we actually do know the author, and we also know roughly the time and historical situation. And these things matter. They might not matter quite as much in some of the other books you read. As you now get into the prophets, authorship and when they wrote it absolutely matter. Because we believe these books we call the prophets are prophetic. And prophecy is an interesting word. What does it mean? There's different ways of describing it. Some people describe prophecy as, forthtelling or predicting the future, which is certainly a use for it. The most basic understanding of the word prophecy is somebody essentially hearing something from God and then saying it out, communicating what God is saying. Which, if you think about that, is kind of a big deal. To put yourself in a position to be saying, this is what the Lord is saying, that's no small thing. So a prophet in the Old Testament was a person believed to be empowered by the Spirit of God, or anointed is the word they often used, with the commission to communicate God's will, his word, his message to humanity. Prophets were the mouthpiece of God to the people. And in the Old Testament, there were a lot of prophets, way more than we have names for. We don't know them all, but these are the ones that were collected and saved and written down. And so you can read in your text this week, it talks a bit about some of the different ways that you should know if someone is or isn't a prophet. That's not really where we're going with an overview of the Old Testament. We have the books that we believe God wants us to have. And so we can take these books known as the prophets and read them for what they are and let them speak to us as they do. But because a prophet was somebody that represented God's word and spoke for God, it means they had tremendous authority and responsibility. Their words were the very words of God himself. So for this reason, these writings only have the significance they do because of who wrote them. So if you go back, we talked a little bit about the book of Job. And in the book of Job, it's like, we don't really know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. It doesn't really matter. There's a philosophical point. That's not the case with these books. If we don't know who wrote these books, if a prophet didn't write these books, well, then they're not prophecy, right? So something can be in the Bible and not be prophecy. We saw that in the book of Proverbs, right? A proverb is just sort of a wise statement. It doesn't really matter who wrote it if it's generally true. These books come to us very differently. These books come to us as, no, these are the words of God, and therefore we need to know, is this person actually a prophet? So you think about the difference between wisdom, literature, art, all the stuff we saw in the previous section. No, now we're talking about words from God. So authorship matters, and then when they're writing, what they're writing about matters. So each of the 16 prophetic books is unique for its situation. They're all written in a real specific time and place, in real scenarios, real life situations going on. But there are some big ideas, overall themes of their message. So we'll walk through, some of the bigger books we'll walk through in more length. Some of the shorter ones we'll go through quickly. But we'll look for individual messages. What's the main theme of each of these prophetic books? What are they getting at? But we can also step back and say this whole section, what are overall themes that the prophets do? So as you start to get into them, you can kind of know what you're working with. So let me give you a few big ideas, the main themes of the Old Testament prophets. And the first was simply this: the prophet's primary responsibility was to constantly call people back to faithfulness. They were there to constantly remind the people when they were going astray, when things weren't going right. So this was a different function than a priest. A priest's job was to maintain the temple, make sure worship was being done appropriately. And then you had the king, who was responsible politically to lead the people. The prophet was the voice saying, this is where God is going. God is saying, don't do that. And again, the prophet was called by God to tell the people, you're straying, you're going too far. Not that, calling them back to faithfulness, reminding them of God's expectations, sometimes announcing or reminding of the curses and blessings that they agreed to when they said yes to the covenant, a big theme we've talked about throughout this course. And so they call out sin. They remind people of God's laws. They're like, hey, remember this, God said not to do this, and you're falling into this. And they often predict the punishment or curses that will come from it. Hey, remember guys, you said yes to a covenant, and God said, if you don't obey him, this is going to happen. I am speaking for God right now and telling you this is on its way. Vice versa, they also could announce blessing and, hey, just remember the goodness that comes from God. They were a voice reminding and calling the people back to faithfulness, to remember what they said yes to in the covenant. The prophets also, though, continued to reveal God and his character. These prophets knew God. They had a relationship with God. They heard him speak. And so when they spoke about God, oftentimes you can read the prophets and you can learn more about who God is. There's theology in these because these were men hearing from God and communicating who he is and what he says. So while there's specific times and places to the prophets that maybe don't apply to us today, these books reveal things about who God is through the message of the prophets. Again and again, they serve to remind Israel of its purpose. That God is doing something as Israel to redeem the world and bless the nations. So it'll include comments on other nations, announcing God's judgment on them as well. You know, God is over all the world, but at their core, the prophets are like, remember Israel, what you're called to. So it's fitting that these books come towards the end of the story, because they wouldn't make a lot of sense if you didn't get the beginning. If you didn't understand the covenant, if you didn't understand what happened with Abraham and Moses and the agreements of Deuteronomy and the history of the people trying to be faithful, then understanding the prophets is almost impossible. And then lastly, they give hope to a future. All the prophets will often say, like, a lot of them are dark and negative, things are bad, but they'll always often point to something greater happening. This is still a fulfillment of what God is doing. There's still the promises that God has made to the whole world. You know, so there's like optimism within the critique. Those things happen at the same time. There's the critique of things are not going well, you're sinning, you're failing, whatever, but there's also optimism. Remember, God is wanting to heal the world through you. And so there will be sometimes prophetic announcements about what's currently happening. And other times, you know, remember what God is still going to do in the future. God's judgment is often paired with his everlasting faithfulness and love for his people. So all 16 prophets sort of carry those ideas behind the scenes in their own individual messages. And then let me just give you two things before we dive into the first one together. A couple thoughts about understanding their message. They're all written differently. They all have their own unique flavor. So each book probably needs to have its own how to understand this prophet. But the first is this: always remember, each of the 16 address specific real life situations. They're not theoretical. Again, go back to Job. Job was kind of a theoretical, philosophical idea about life and the problem of evil. Now, these books are something is actually happening and they're addressing it. Real people talking to real people. So the best way to really make sense of each of these books is to know the context or history of when it was written, what was going on in Israel at the time. You have great political upheaval. Empires are rising and falling. You have the kingdoms being divided. You have people falling away from the covenant faithfulness, wrestling with whether or not they should still follow God. Then you have the captivity of the Assyrians, the Babylon. I mean, there's so much going on. Kingdom divided in north and south. So you have the books of Samuel and you have the books of Kings and Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. The history books that we covered in the second section give some context for understanding the prophetic messages. So if you take each prophet and put it somewhere in its history, you'll know what's going on and what they're talking about. So as we walk through the books together, with each of the prophetic books that we cover, I'll give you some historical context. This is when this prophet was prophesying in Israel's history, so you know what was going on and why they were saying what they were saying. And then the other thing that's interesting and difficult about these books is oftentimes there is what we call a near and an ultimate future in mind. And I think this gets difficult for us because it's like saying there are times that the prophets, especially prophets like an Isaiah or maybe like an Ezekiel, might have a specific in the moment issue they're addressing, but their prophecy might also be looking further ahead, whether it's further ahead 70 years or whether it's looking further ahead to the coming Messiah, which would be, another 400 or 500 years, or is it looking ahead to the ultimate end? Sometimes we're not really sure. They predicted future events that could this be soon? Is this not happen? Some things in the Old Testament prophets almost look like they haven't happened yet. And there's wrestlings among Christians. Well, have they been fulfilled in the church? Have they not been fulfilled? This is an Old Testament survey. We're not getting into that. But just keep in mind that it's always within context. There's always a historical reality, but sometimes the prophets were looking further ahead, and you have to sort of sift through that as you're reading each one. And then lastly, keep in mind again that this is also difficult. Some of the prophets were very direct and just spoke plainly, the way that Paul would write his letters. Other prophets were very poetic and flowery. Ezekiel writes in imagery and things that are the book of Hosea. The whole thing is practically a metaphor. So you have to take each prophet individually, and sometimes even like a book like Jeremiah is a mixture. There's narrative, there's story, and then there's oracles and prophecies, and you're like, just keep in mind that sometimes the prophets wrote in poetic fashion. Sometimes they used imagery, sometimes they used analogies, metaphors. You have to apply all the concepts that we've been talking about throughout this course, parallelisms, evocative language. All of this shows up because you have 16 different prophets wrote all differently and varied. So it can be a challenge to get through them, but they're really a beautiful collection of writing that speak to Israel's story, their history, but more importantly, speak to what God was and is and continues to do. So we're going to get into these books together, walk through them, and see what they have to say, starting with the first major prophet named Isaiah in the next video. Thanks, guys.